So sin can be kind of a naughty word in English. People don't like using it or describing things as sin. But how much have you thought about what sin actually is? I've thought a fair bit about it, and I just wanted to share some observations with y'all about that subject. So I think, first off, we're actually kind of held back in English because of where the word sin comes from. The word sin is derived from the concept of guilt. But in other languages, the concept that translates to sin or is is translated to from the same thing that sin is translated from, it can be quite different. For instance, in Spanish, the word is pecado, and pecado is a derivative from the concept of stumbling. So in English, we have the same sort of idea of, but in English we render it as a guilt concept, whereas in Spanish you're rendering it as a struggling concept or a stumbling concept. And I think the Spanish notion is a lot healthier, whereas the English notion does trip us up a fair bit because we do associate sin so heavily with guilt. Because the reality is sin. I think a healthy notion of sin, anyway, is much more complicated than guilt. There definitely is sin that should incur guilt, and should and is a terrible thing, and people should be held accountable for in a very often severe way. When we get into some of the more serious sins, things like homicide, obviously, or like womanizing, exploitation, predation on your fellow human, whether that be economic or physical or whatever. There's a lot of ways. There's a lot of sin that does properly belong to guilt, but sin, in the concept of stumbling, can be almost innocent. It can be ignorant. It can be negligent. It could be accidental. It could be confused. So it's like you could sin in a stumbling like you can stumble because you're confused, because you're ignorant, because you didn't have the foresight that you needed, or because you didn't pay attention in class, or things like that. And I think and the reason why I think this stumbling concept is so much healthier is because it allows us to talk about our mistakes or even our intentional errors in a more diverse way, and we also don't miss things out. Because when you think about guilt, for instance, we don't generally think of needing to feel guilt about hurting ourselves. But if we talk about sin in the terms of causing ourselves to stumble, then it makes a lot more sense to talk about that than it does to talk about making ourselves guilty towards ourselves. And I think that's how I ultimately see sin. I see sin as being something that either causes ourselves or somebody else to stumble. And that stumbling can mean several things: either struggling with something, struggling to do something good, failing to do something good, or doing something bad actively. So it's like, and that's kind of an interesting thing, is what, like, sin doesn't just have to be doing bad things. It can also be failing to do good things or struggling to do good things. And that's not necessarily sinister either. It's not, but it is something that is worth changing about yourself, and working to better. It's worth getting out of your own way and not putting roadblocks in your own path. So, like, in the English sense of guilt, for instance, it wouldn't be like, in the sense of guilt, it wouldn't be correct to say that, like, for instance, somebody who's like a drug abuser, alcohol abuser should feel an incredible level of guilt. That isn't productive. But it is correct to say that they are putting stumbling blocks in their own path, that they are obstructing themselves. They're making their own lives harder, and limiting how much they can help both themselves and others. And when you so I just think it's really important to develop that different sense of sin and be willing to discuss sin not just in a guilt sense, but also discuss it in a, am I in my own way? Am I in other people's way? Even if I'm not hurting them, am I preventing them from having a better life? Things like that, which is it's a lot more meaningful and powerful to think about it this way. It's harder, to be sure, but it's more worthwhile. And I think you can even see it in some ways spread out across, like, English society, just in how we, like in the United States, we don't necessarily do a very good job helping people realize their potential, or really addressing culturally certain things that cause people to hurt themselves. Things like, for instance, drug abuse. Like a lot of discussion about like legality of drugs focuses on a lot on whether or not somebody's hurting somebody else, not on whether they're hurting themselves or limiting themselves. Because limiting yourself is also not great. And here's why this matters on a social scale, because everybody needs help throughout their lives. Like none of us are truly self-sufficient, independent, things like that. We all need help from others. Just because life is hard and sad and tragic, and there's a lot of, and we just don't have the internal strength to deal with things all the time. And even if we do, even when we do have the strength to handle something hard, we'd still handle it better with the help of someone else. So when you don't have a sense of that, and you don't have a culture that focuses on helping people realize their own potential and allows people to limit them, it doesn't allow, but like is very unconcerned with people limiting themselves or like obstructing themselves, crippling themselves even in many cases. What ends up happening is we end up not having enough people around to help. Like if I obstruct myself, if I don't work like fairly diligently on improving myself and learning and like getting out of my own way, like avoiding obstructing myself and things like that, there will be people throughout my life who I could have helped if I had gotten rid of those obstructions, but who I won't help because I left those obstructions there. You can see this like in the drug example is just an easy one, but it's like it's easy enough to say that you're not hurting anyone when you do drugs yourself, but if you're doing drugs, you can't like on a regular basis, you can't parent, you can't, like if a friend comes over in need, or like if an emergency happens and you're high, you're not going to be in a position to help, where if you were sober, you would be able to help. Or at least be in a better position to help. It's like you might, it can make the simple difference between hearing the phone ring and calling 911 or not doing anything. Just because you're not together enough to even do that. And I think that is one of the crises our country is facing right now, is we don't have enough people who are in a position to help. I mean, even looking at like mental health issues in therapy, it's like, what would the role of therapy be if we all had really good friendships and like our friends were like, we all had friends willing to help us in times of need? Like how severe would like even things like ambulances aren't nearly as necessary when you have, like, if you could trust your neighbors to take you to the hospital, or things like that, which is just an interesting thing. Like a lot of the sensation of loneliness many of us feel, the sensation of things getting worse and things like that, isn't because people aren't willing to help, people don't want to help, but a lot of the times it's just people are like we've kind of been raised to not be helpers, to not make the choices that are necessary to become helpers and put ourselves in positions where we can actually help the people around us, which is troubling, because it's like a lot of us do want to help. There are a lot of helpers in society. But oftentimes, a lot of people who don't become helpers or don't even learn to want to help because of sin obstructing them, of them stumbling over it, and because they are stumbling, they can't help somebody else up. And that's the thing. It's like we'll still try to help, and it's always good to try to help, even when you're stumbling yourself. Like assuming it's viable, it's the whole airline instruction thing. You don't want, don't put on somebody else's mask until you've secured your own kind of situation. It's like you do need to be able to take care of yourself, but it's a lot harder to help people when you're stumbling, and it's very limited. Your ability to help others is very limited when you're in a stumbling state, and unfortunately, we really do need a modicum of power of stability, of clarity, of peace, to be able to efficaciously help others in many cases. And I'm not saying that we need like perfection of any of those things, but it's like we do need to get out of our own way if we want to be a helper, because all of us have experienced it where we needed help and nobody was there to help. And basically my suggestion just is that largely on account of sin, but also some other factors like systemic issues, there wasn't anybody in a position to help, even though in a better world, in a kinder society, there would have been. That many of the times when we were left without help, there should have been a helper, and there would have been a helper if people had made different choices, which is a very tragic thing, like an extraordinarily sad thing, because, and like not to like assign guilt to the people who aren't there to help either, because a lot of them would probably be mortified. Like when I reflect on the fact that like I've got my vices, and knowing that those vices have probably impeded me from helping certain people, and that if I hadn't had those vices, there would be people who needed help who I would have helped otherwise if I had been better. Like that's a very real thing, and I think that's something we need to be more conscious of in our culture right now. So that this may be a bit repetitive, but it really does just come down to how much we need to be people who can help, and and thinking about sin in a healthy fashion is essential to that. Because if we aren't willing to change or remove stumbling blocks from our path, if we're not willing to get out of our own way or change, then we're in a very bad state. And we don't get to help. And other people suffer because of our inability to help, which is a really and it's extra tragic because nobody wants that. It's like nobody, like when people are like struggling with vice, when I'm struggling with vice, it's like I'm not like doing it like with the intention to not help somebody else, but that is at least part of the reality of the situation. So yeah, it's important to figure this out and do your best and fight against sin, so to speak. And just to round it off, I just want to make it very clear that like struggling with sin is not something you should feel like. It's not a thing that you need to feel guilty about either, because it's as long as you are struggling, so to speak, so long as you're not complacent about the existence of that sin, because it's like sin can be hard to remove. That is not a fiction. It can be incredibly difficult to change, but the human capacity for change is incredible. And that is also true. So, and that's kind of like the way we kind of need to figure out how to live our lives, to live with the dual truths that change is hard and change is possible and change is worthwhile. Because it doesn't just help ourselves. It doesn't just prevent us from hurting others, but it also puts us in a position to help others when they need it. And indeed, a lot of the difficulty that is associated with change, a lot of the reasons why it's so hard to change, is because there often isn't as much help as there should be, because we're not receiving help and we're not offering help to people when they are trying to change. So yeah, this is basically how I view sin. It's kind of a more holistic concept than just guilt or harm or evil. Like evil is certainly a part of it. Guilt is certainly a part of it. Harm is definitely a part of it, but also lack of good is part of it. Lack of growth, lack of progress, lack of joy, missing out on things that make you happy. So, and I think it's just important for that, because I don't think anything less will help us achieve what we want from life or others. We won't be able to help others self-actualize or realize their own worth, their own potential, how much they can help themselves and others. We won't realize it for ourselves without having a healthier concept of sin than just guilt and evil. So And even if you go back to like Christian scripture, which is, kind of the boogeyman for a lot of the concept of sin. It's like if you actually do a close reading, it's like there is a much healthier concept of sin in the Bible than is often depicted. And of course, plenty of preachers and teachers are certainly responsible for teaching unhealthy concepts of sin. But that just goes back to the point of it's a sin to misteach what sin is, and to make people believe things about sin that aren't true, and impede people in their ability to improve themselves or change. So, those are my thoughts. Hope you all will take care, stay safe, and let's do our best, whatever that best is. And not just do our best, but think about what could be our best, what our best could be, and how we can change what our best is, or expand it. Because that's a fun, I don't know, I like that. I really like that bit, because you do it long enough, and a few years go by, and suddenly you're like, wow, I'm helping people or doing things that I couldn't have done 2 years ago or 3 years ago. And like, I can think about people who've been helped, and I can just be really grateful that they're okay. So yeah, see y'all on the flip side.